It was the kind of job that promised peace, solitude, and a fresh start. Everything I was looking for after a string of failed attempts to find myself. I'd been stuck in the grind of city life for too long. The noise, the crowds, and the constant sense of being overwhelmed. When I saw the advertisement for a caretaker at a remote farm, I thought it might be the perfect escape. The ad was simple. Caretaker wanted for an abandoned farm. Free housing and a chance to live on secluded property. Responsibilities include farm maintenance and crop care. Must be reliable and able to work independently. No contact details, just a location, an old farm on the outskirts of town. Something about it tugged at me. The price was right, the idea of escaping into nature was appealing, and, in a way, I felt like this could be the chance I needed to clear my head. The phone call came sooner than I expected. The voice on the other end was warm but slightly tired. A man who introduced himself as Henry, the previous caretaker. He spoke in a quiet, measured tone, explaining that the farm had been abandoned for years, but the crops had grown wild, the barns were still standing, and everything was mostly in working order. When I asked why he was leaving, he was quick to answer. A change of pace. I've been here too long and it's time to move on. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. Something about the whole situation felt off, but in a way, it made me more eager to start. I needed to get away. I was tired of my old life, so after confirming the pay and the terms, I agreed to the position. A few days later, I packed my things into my old car and set off for the farm. The road was winding and narrow, the kind of rural path that didn't see much traffic. The scenery became more isolated as I drove further, the towering trees seeming to close in around me until I reached a small clearing where the farm stood. It looked exactly as advertised, untouched, like something frozen in time. The main house was a weathered two-story farmhouse, the roof sagging slightly under the weight of the years of neglect. The barn, a few yards away, was even older, with its wooden slats peeling and the hayloft barely standing. The fields surrounding the house were overgrown with wild grasses and thick vines, but I could still make out faint lines of the rows where crops had once been. Everything looked like it had been abandoned in a rush, like the previous owners had just packed up and left without a word. I parked my car by the front gate and stood for a moment, taking it all in. There was a quietness here, a deep, almost unnatural stillness. The air was still, without the usual rustling of leaves or the chirping of birds. It felt like the world itself had stopped, as if the farm had been untouched by time. Even the wind, which normally carried the scent of earth and nature, seemed to be held at bay. The front door creaked as I entered, and I was greeted by a dusty interior, the smell of aged wood and abandoned things. The furniture was sparse, worn down by years of exposure to the elements, but there were enough essentials to make it livable. The kitchen was small but functional, with an old wood stove in the corner. The rooms upstairs were simple, nothing fancy, just a bed, a chair, and a small desk. It was the perfect setup for someone who wanted to escape from the world. I wandered around, trying to get my bearings, and noticed a journal on a small table near the kitchen. It was open, as though someone had left it there recently, but the pages were yellowed with age. Curiosity got the best of me, and I flipped through the pages, reading about the daily tasks and the routines the previous caretakers had kept. Most of it was mundane: farm maintenance, crop care, managing the property, but the further I read, the more I noticed an odd pattern in the entries. The earlier entries were dated, but as the journal continued, there were large gaps in time. Some pages were blank, and others were filled with hastily written notes about strange occurrences, crops growing too quickly, wildlife acting strangely, and unexplained noises at night. There were mentions of the previous caretakers feeling uneasy, but nothing specific. They wrote about the land as if it was somehow different from other places, as though the farm itself had a mind of its own. I closed the journal quickly, a shiver running down my spine. It could have been paranoia or a quirky sense of humor from the previous caretakers. Maybe they'd written it just to pass the time, but something about it didn't sit right. I shook it off and moved on, determined to get to work the next day and clear my head. That evening, I made dinner in the small kitchen and sat down by the window, looking out over the fields. The last rays of the sun cast long shadows across the land, and the farm looked almost peaceful in the fading light. But as the darkness grew deeper, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. There was something in the air, something that felt as if the land was watching me, waiting for something. I dismissed the feeling as nothing more than my imagination, but as I closed the blinds and got ready for bed, I couldn't help but feel that I had made a decision I didn't fully understand. The next morning, I woke up early, eager to start my duties. The sun had risen high, casting a golden glow over the land. But as I ventured outside, I was struck by an unsettling sight. The crops in the fields weren't just wild grasses. They were growing in unnatural rows, perfectly lined up. And more than that, they seemed to have grown overnight, their green stems stretching unnaturally tall, twisting in ways that felt wrong. I paused, staring at the fields. The crops seemed to shift in the breeze as though they were alive, responding to something, responding to me. As I stood there, staring at the crops, I felt a sense of unease that I couldn't quite shake. The fields in front of me, which had appeared overgrown and wild the night before, now looked strangely ordered, as if someone had carefully arranged them overnight. The plants had grown at an alarming rate, their stems thick and their leaves lush, almost as though they were thriving in defiance of nature's rules. And the way they seemed to move, ever so slightly, in the wind, sent a chill through me. I had expected some weeds, maybe some wildflowers, but this was different. The crops were too healthy, too vibrant for a farm that had been abandoned for years. The more I stared, the more it seemed as if the plants were reaching, stretching their leaves and vines toward me, almost alive, as if they were aware of my presence. I shook off the unsettling thought. It was just my imagination running wild, I told myself. After all, plants do grow quickly, especially in the right conditions. I had to get to work. The farm wasn't going to take care of itself. I made my way over to the barn to begin my daily tasks, but even as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the fields. The hair on the back of my neck prickled, and I quickened my pace. The barn was just as I had expected, empty, with a faint smell of hay and wood rot lingering in the air. I checked the tool shed next, making sure everything was in order for the tasks I needed to complete. I set to work, repairing the fences and clearing away the debris from the past seasons. But even as I worked, I couldn't help but glance back at the fields every now and then, my eyes drawn to the crops that had grown so unnaturally fast. By midday, I had finished most of the tasks I had planned, but something about the day felt off. The air had become thick, almost suffocating, and the sounds of nature that should have surrounded me, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, had all fallen silent. The quiet was oppressive, as if the land itself was holding its breath. I felt like I was being pulled toward the fields again, drawn in by some unseen force, I couldn't resist. I made my way back to the crops, my heart beating faster with each step. The plants, which had seemed so vibrant earlier, now appeared even more alive, their leaves glistening in the midday sun, almost as if they were breathing. I knelt down beside them, my fingers brushing the thick stalks. The leaves were soft, too soft for plants that should have been exposed to the elements for so long. And then I felt it. Movement beneath the surface of the soil. My breath caught in my throat. The ground trembled, just slightly, but it was enough to make me pull my hand back in shock. Something was beneath the soil, alive, shifting, moving. I stood quickly, looking around in panic. The crops seemed to be pulsing now, almost as if they were responding to my fear, their stems bending and twisting in unnatural ways. The air grew colder, and the feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time, as if the farm was trying to tell me something, trying to warn me. I backed away from the crops, my heart racing. I had to get away from them. Something was terribly wrong here, and I didn't know what it was, but I was beginning to feel like I was in over my head. As I turned to walk back toward the barn, a soft, whispering sound drifted through the air. It was faint, barely audible, but I could hear it. It was like the sound of leaves rustling, but it didn't sound natural. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like a chant. I spun around, searching the fields for the source of the sound, but there was no one there. The crops were still, silent once again. I felt my pulse quicken as I turned back to the barn, but the whispering grew louder, more distinct, as if the crops were speaking to me. My steps quickened, and I ran back to the barn, my mind racing. I needed to get inside. I needed to be away from the fields. I slammed the door shut behind me, trying to catch my breath, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. The whispering continued, growing faint again, as if it had never been there at all. That evening, as the sun set, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened during the day. The crops had been acting strange, yes, but I didn't know what to make of it. Was it just my imagination? Was I seeing things? No, it didn't feel like that. There was something alive about the farm, something unnatural that had nothing to do with ordinary farming. It felt as though the land itself was aware of me, responding to my every move, watching me, waiting for something. I went to bed early that night, hoping sleep would help calm my racing mind. But as I lay in the dark, I heard the faint sound of scraping, like something was moving just outside my window. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sound grew louder, more deliberate. I sat up in bed, straining my ears. The noise was coming from the fields, the same place where I'd felt that sense of foreboding earlier. My heart raced. I grabbed my flashlight and quickly ran out of the cabin, the cold air biting at my skin. As I stepped outside, I could see the silhouettes of the crops swaying in the wind, but the rustling had stopped. I stood there, trying to listen for anything unusual, but the silence of the night pressed in on me. The farm was still, far too still, but deep down, I knew the truth. The crops had a life of their own, and whatever was beneath the surface was far from ordinary. And whatever had been waiting for me on this farm, it wasn't finished yet. The next morning, the sun rose slowly, casting long shadows over the fields. I had barely slept the night before, the haunting sound of scraping in the dark lingering in my ears. I kept thinking I had imagined it, that it was just the wind, but deep inside I knew that it wasn't. Something unnatural was happening on this farm, something I couldn't explain, and every part of me screamed that I needed to get out of here. But for some reason, I couldn't leave. Not yet. I walked outside to the fields, feeling the tension in the air. The crops, once lush and unnervingly healthy, now looked even more unnatural. The corn stalks, tall and thick, seemed to tower over me as I walked past them, their leaves rustling softly in a way that felt deliberate, like they were waiting for me to make a move. As I approached the edge of the field, I felt a shift, an invisible weight pressing down on me. It was as if the ground itself had become alive, sensing my unease. I stopped and looked down at the plants beneath my feet, expecting to see the usual soil. But what I saw made my blood run cold. The earth itself was moving. It wasn't just the wind shifting the dirt, the ground was breathing. Small undulations rippled through the earth as if something beneath the surface was trying to make its way to the surface. The soil moved in pulses, almost rhythmically, like the land itself was alive, responding to something I couldn't see. I stepped back instinctively, my heart racing, my breath quickening. I had never felt this way about a farm, about the earth beneath my feet. I had worked with crops before, tending gardens and fields, but I had never experienced anything like this. These plants, they were alive in a way that no plant should be. I had heard stories of farms being haunted, of strange occurrences on old properties, but I'd never believed them. I'd never imagined that nature itself could become something so wrong. I turned and began walking back toward the barn, but as I did, I felt a presence behind me. It was subtle at first, a fleeting sensation, but then it grew stronger, until it felt like something was following me, walking just a few steps behind. My pulse quickened again, and I turned quickly, expecting to see someone, perhaps a lost animal or a shadow cast by the trees, but there was nothing. Only the crops, silent and still, watching me with their twisted, unnatural shapes. The closer I got to the barn, the stronger the sensation of being watched became. I hurried inside, slamming the door behind me, trying to calm myself. There was no logical explanation for what I had felt outside. The crops were just plants, right? Just ordinary crops. But they didn't seem ordinary at all. They didn't seem natural. Inside the barn, I tried to distract myself with the usual tasks. I organized some of the old farming tools, swept the floor, and checked the storage room. But nothing could shake the feeling of unease that clung to me. Every time I turned my back, I felt like something was there, watching me from the dark corners of the barn. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see a shadow moving just beyond the panes, but there was nothing. That night, I decided to explore further. The creeping fear that had been slowly building in me was becoming unbearable. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know what was happening on this farm. After dinner, I grabbed a flashlight and ventured back into the fields. The crops were still, but I knew they were watching. They weren't just plants. They were aware, reacting to my presence. I walked past the rows of corn, the flashlight beam illuminating the thick stalks. But as I moved further into the field, I noticed something I hadn't before. The crops weren't all the same. Some of them were bent, their stalks twisted at unnatural angles. Others were rotting, their leaves shriveled and blackened, as if they had been infected by something. I knelt down to examine one of the rotting stalks, the smell of decay rising into the air. But as I touched the plant, something happened. The ground beneath me shifted again, and I felt a sudden pressure, like the earth itself was responding to my touch. The stalk jerked in my hand, twisting and pulling away from me with an unnatural force. I yanked my hand back, but it was too late. The ground shook again, harder this time, and the crops around me seemed to stir. The leaves began to rustle, moving even though there was no wind. I heard a faint, almost imperceptible whispering sound, rising from the very earth beneath me, like the plants were speaking, calling out to something. My breath caught in my throat as I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing. Suddenly, I noticed something horrifying. The rotten crops weren't just decaying, they were alive. The roots, which should have been buried in the soil, were emerging from the ground, stretching toward me like reaching hands. The tendrils of the plants curled up, wrapping around the base of the healthy crops, twisting into knots. It was as if the crops were fighting, struggling against each other, but in a way that felt deliberate, like they were alive and aware. I stumbled back, my legs shaking, my mind racing to make sense of what was happening. I didn't know if I was losing my mind or if the farm itself had become something else. The plants were changing, growing, reaching, their movements almost coordinated, like they were part of a single living organism. The longer I stood there, the more I felt the pressure building, as if the land itself was closing in on me, trying to consume me. I had to leave. I had to get away from this place, but I couldn't move. The crops, those twisted, living plants, seemed to be closing in, their roots snaking through the soil, their leaves reaching for me like the fingers of a monstrous hand. The whispers grew louder, like a chorus of voices rising from the earth. I turned and fled, not looking back as the field seemed to come alive behind me. The following day, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me. My mind kept replaying the events from the night before, the crops moving, the rotting plants twisting and shifting beneath my feet. I had tried to convince myself it was just an overactive imagination, a product of my isolation and fear. But the reality of what I had witnessed was undeniable. The farm wasn't just abandoned, it was alive, and whatever force had taken root here had been waiting for someone like me to come along. I couldn't afford to ignore it any longer. I had been hired to take care of the farm, and I had a job to do. I needed to harvest the crops, to clear the fields so that they could be replanted in the coming season. But the thought of stepping back into those fields, of confronting the unknown, filled me with a sense of overwhelming unease. Still, I couldn't put it off any longer. I had to face whatever was happening. I grabbed the scythe from the barn and made my way toward the fields. The crops seemed to be waiting for me, standing tall and imposing, their thick stalks swaying ever so slightly in the breeze. As I walked, I felt the same sense of being watched again, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. The plants seemed to react to my every movement, their leaves rustling as if whispering, though there was no wind. The field ahead of me stretched out in every direction, rows of corn, wheat, and vegetables growing side by side in wild chaos. The crops had already reached their peak, ripe and heavy, but the sight of them now filled me with a creeping sense of unease. It was as if the harvest was no longer just a simple task. It was part of something bigger, something I didn't understand, something that had plans for me. I started with the outermost row, bending down to cut the stalks. The plants felt unnervingly soft under my hands, their leaves slipping through my fingers like silk rather than the roughness I was used to. When I brought the scythe down on one of the stalks, it cut cleanly, but the way the plant collapsed seemed wrong. It wasn't a simple fall to the ground. It was like the plant resisted, bending and twisting before finally giving in, as though it didn't want to be severed. I paused, staring at the crop in confusion. It felt as though the plants themselves were fighting back, resisting the very act of harvesting. My hands were shaking as I reached down again to grab another stalk, trying to finish the task as quickly as possible. But as I pulled at the plant, I felt a sudden tug, a strange, forceful resistance from below, as though the plant's roots were holding fast to the earth, unwilling to let go. The hairs on my neck stood up as the ground beneath me shifted. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The soil seemed to tremble as though the earth itself was reacting to my presence. I took a cautious step back, my eyes scanning the field. The crops around me seemed to grow taller, their leaves swaying more wildly, and I could feel the pressure mounting, as if the plants were alive, watching me. I turned to leave, but the moment I stepped back, I was hit with a wave of energy, a force so strong it made me stumble. The crops seemed to move on their own, their roots shifting beneath the soil, pulling, twisting, like the field itself was trying to pull me back into the earth. I gasped, pulling my foot free from the ground, but the more I tried to move, the more the crops seemed to reach for me. Panic set in. My heart raced as I scrambled backward, my legs shaking. I had to get out of there. But the plants weren't just reaching for me, they were closing in, surrounding me with their thick stems and twisting vines. The sound of their rustling leaves filled the air, growing louder and more frantic, as though the plants were crying out in frustration. I could feel the roots pulling at my feet, holding me in place, and I knew, if I didn't escape now, I would be consumed by the very ground I had tried to harvest. With a final, desperate effort, I wrenched myself free from the clutches of the crops, stumbling backward toward the barn. The pressure from the plants eased as I reached the safety of the building, but the terrifying sensation of being followed lingered. I turned to look behind me, but the field was still, quiet again, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better now. The crops had minds of their own, and they weren't going to let me simply take what I wanted. They were a part of something much older, much darker than I had ever imagined. The land was alive, and it wasn't just the farm I had to worry about. It was the curse that had taken root here, and now I was its caretaker. I ran inside the barn, slamming the door behind me, my breath ragged, my heart still racing. The barn was silent, but I could feel the weight of the land pressing in, as if it were waiting for me to make a choice, stay and become a part of the farm, or leave and risk its wrath. The whispering started again, faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but this time it felt more insistent, more real. It was as though the land itself was calling to me, trying to pull me back into the field. I needed to make a decision. I needed to understand what I was dealing with before it consumed me completely. I spent the next few days locked in the barn, pacing back and forth, unable to shake the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled over me. Every time I tried to step outside to tend to the crops, I was met with a deep, unsettling pull. The feeling that the earth itself was urging me to stay away, to turn back. My dreams had become nightmares, each one filled with twisted visions of the crops, their roots writhing like serpent-like creatures, reaching out for me, pulling me into the soil. The whispering had grown louder too. At night, when the wind was still, I would hear the faint rustling of leaves, only to realize that it wasn't the wind at all. It was the plants, whispering to each other, as if they were alive, speaking in a language I couldn't understand but felt deep in my bones. I knew that the farm wasn't just a place. It wasn't just a plot of land. The crops, the earth, the very soil. It was all part of something much darker, something ancient. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed answers. I needed to know what had happened on this farm and why it had become so corrupted. I went back to the farmhouse, determined to find anything that might explain the strange events I had witnessed. As I scoured the rooms, I came across an old, dusty chest in the attic. It was locked, but I managed to pry it open with a crowbar I found in the barn. Inside, there were several items: old photographs, yellowed documents, and a thick journal that looked much older than the others I had found. The journal was written in longhand, but the writing was frantic, almost scattered, as though the author had been under tremendous stress. I could feel the weight of the words as I turned the pages, and what I read made my stomach twist in knots. The journal belonged to the original owner of the farm, a man named Thomas Greer. He had written about the growth of the farm's crops, how the land had yielded bountiful harvests far beyond anything natural. But as the years went by, the crops became increasingly unnatural, growing at an alarming rate, and the soil seemed to take on a strange, almost sentient quality. Greer wrote of dreams he couldn't explain, of strange shadows he saw moving among the plants at night, of whispers in the wind. The journal described how, one by one, each of the caretakers had gone missing, vanishing without a trace, their last words always the same: "The land is calling." The more I read, the more the truth became clear. This farm wasn't just a place of growth, it was a place of sacrifice. The land itself had been cursed long ago, and in return for prosperity, the crops had demanded something in exchange: a soul, a life to keep the land fertile, to keep the harvests abundant. Each caretaker had become a part of the farm, trapped within the very soil they had worked so hard to cultivate. I sat back, my hands trembling, as the full weight of what I had learned hit me. The land wasn't just cursed, it was alive. The crops were a manifestation of that curse, feeding off the souls of those who worked the farm, claiming them when the time was right. And now, it had claimed me. It was no coincidence that I had been hired to tend to this land. The farm had called me here, and it wasn't going to let me leave. The farm fed on fear, on sacrifice, and it had its sights set on me. I needed to leave. I needed to break the curse, to get away from this living nightmare. But I knew that it wasn't going to be that simple. The journal spoke of a ritual, a way to end the curse, but it came with a heavy price. The ritual required the blood of a willing participant, someone who was bound to the land. The land had claimed Ben, and it was now calling me to fulfill the curse, to sacrifice myself so that the crops could be free, so that the land could continue its endless cycle of life and death. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let the crops claim another soul. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized the truth. There was no way out. The farm had already decided. It had already begun its ritual, and I was caught in its web. I had become a part of it. I grabbed the journal, the only thing that seemed to hold the key to the farm's dark past, and ran back to the fields. The crops had become even more aggressive in the past few days, their leaves twitching, their vines reaching out like hands, grasping at the air. The earth beneath me felt warmer now, almost as though it was alive and breathing. I could hear the whispering again, louder this time, like the crops were calling to me, urging me to join them. I knew what I had to do. The ritual had to be stopped, and I was the only one who could stop it. I took the journal in hand and walked to the heart of the field, the place where the crops seemed to be alive in the most unnatural way. There, in the center of the field, I saw a strange altar, made from rocks and twisted roots, covered in the same symbols I had seen in the journal. The final step was simple. I had to destroy the altar, destroy the heart of the farm. I took a match and set the journal aflame, watching as the words burned into nothing. The fire spread quickly, reaching the roots, the center of the crops, and the ground shook violently beneath me. The plants screamed, their leaves shrieking in agony as the fire consumed them. I stood there, watching the flames, knowing that in doing this, I had broken the curse. The farm would never be the same. But the farm was no longer mine to tend. It had claimed me, but it would never take another soul. The flames crackled around me, their orange glow illuminating the field as the fire began to spread. It felt like the earth itself was roaring in anger, the crops twisting and writhing as though they were alive, struggling to escape the flames. The scent of burning plants filled the air, sweet and sickly, a stench of death. It should have felt like victory, like I had finally taken control, but the painful shrieks of the crops filled the night, and for the first time I realized the full horror of what I had done. The fire raged in the center of the field, and the earth seemed to tremble beneath me. I could feel the farm fighting back, as if it was alive and aware of my every move. The flames licked at the ground, consuming the crops, but still the land seemed to resist. The whispers had turned into screams, rising from the soil itself, desperate and furious. I stumbled backward, my eyes fixed on the altar. The stones that made it up were now cracked and smoldering, the once ancient symbols that had cursed the farm burning away as though they never existed. But even as the fire consumed the crops, something wasn't right. The ground felt too warm, almost burning beneath my feet, and the trees around me began to groan under the pressure, their branches shaking violently as if they were being torn apart. I knew I had to leave. The farm was fighting, and I was caught in its web. The curse had been broken, but the land was not ready to let me go. I could feel it in the air, the presence of something older than the farm itself, something that had been waiting for this moment. Turning, I ran toward the barn, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I made my way back, the earth seemed to shift beneath me, the ground becoming unstable, as though the land itself was rising, trying to pull me back into its grasp. The crops that had been burning for so long seemed to grow back with unnatural speed, the plants reaching for me, their twisted roots wriggling out of the earth like serpents. I looked over my shoulder, fear rising in my chest. The fire was spreading, but the land didn't seem to care. The crops had started growing again, their roots snaking through the soil as they struggled to take hold. I could feel them pulling at my legs, trying to drag me back to the field. The whispers turned into laughter, a hollow sound that echoed from every direction. I ran faster, pushing myself harder than I ever had before. My lungs burned as I neared the barn, but the closer I got, the more the ground seemed to close in around me. I reached the barn door and slammed it shut behind me, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I stood there for a moment, the adrenaline coursing through my veins as I listened to the growing cacophony outside. The whispering voices grew louder, more frantic. The land was trying to hold me here. The curse had been broken, but the farm had become something beyond nature, something that would never let go. I couldn't escape, not unless I left it behind, completely. I grabbed the keys to my car and rushed to the barn door. As I opened it and stepped outside, I noticed something that made my heart stop. The field was empty. The crops were gone. The land, once consumed by the fire, now stood silent, untouched. The soil was blackened, but the plants had completely vanished. For a fleeting moment, I felt a sense of relief. Maybe I had succeeded. Maybe the curse had finally been lifted. But the feeling of unease still clung to me. The land had been angry, and I knew it wasn't truly gone. It would never be gone. The farm, the land, it was something that couldn't be destroyed by fire or by force. It was bound to the earth, to the roots, to the soul of the land itself. I ran to my car, started the engine, and sped down the long dirt road that led away from the farm. The fields, the trees, and the house grew smaller in my rearview mirror. But even as I drove, I felt like something was following me. Something that would always be there, just beyond my reach, waiting for me to return. As I left the farm behind, the road ahead seemed clearer. I was free from the curse, or so I thought. But deep inside, I knew the truth. I had escaped the land, but the land would never forget me. The farm had become part of me now, part of my soul, and no matter how far I ran, it would always be waiting for the next person to tend to its dark harvest. In the end, I realized that some places were never meant to be escaped. They cling to you, to your memories, to your very being. The farm, with its twisted crops and cursed soil, would always be a part of me. And no matter where I went, I would always hear the whispers calling me back